Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Christine Baugh. I'm one of the new research faculty here at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. If I haven't met you, hopefully I do soon. I have the great pleasure of introducing Lauren Taylor today. Lauren's visiting us from Boston. She's currently a doctoral candidate in health policy and management at Harvard Business School. She's got numerous other degrees and talents, but I'm going to keep my introduction short because we're here to listen to Lauren. Her topics have ranged across the social determinants of health, global health ethics, and the talk she has for us today about thinking through how nonprofit organizations should be deciding what funds are acceptable to engage with. So let's give Lauren a Denver welcome.
Thank you. So I don't need those, right? All right. Hi, everybody. Happy Columbus Day. I don't know if you can really say Happy Columbus Day, but in Massachusetts, it's Indigenous Peoples Day. So happy Indigenous Peoples Day. So I'm going to see how I can navigate this circular room. I've never been in a room like this. And so if I start to just stand in a place too long, you know, particularly if you're in the front row, just tap me and I'll try and keep moving. So what I'm going to present here today is one of my dissertation papers. It's a normative paper. So it's a paper that tries to both outline and provide some kind of diagnosis of what do we really think is the problem with nonprofits accepting funds from certain kinds of wrongdoers. That's kind of the first half. And then the second half is trying to propose some kind of framework. And I will say it's a preliminary framework for thinking through how nonprofits make some of these decisions. So I sit at a business school. I've got a background, I trained at a divinity school. I've got a background in organizational theory. And that's kind of the first half of the paper. And then the second half is really where there's kind of some normative ethics. But I will emphasize that it's preliminary. This work has been presented 2 or 3 other places at this point, but it's still a working paper. And so I think we're also recording this. And I said, yes, record it if anyone wants to watch it. But I do fear that like 6 months from now, I may watch this and feel like, oh, that wasn't right. But you're going to help me make it better. So here's how I thought we would spend our time today. I thought first I would try and frame the challenge and put some structure and vocabulary around what we really think is the nature of the problem with a nonprofit like MIT Media Lab accepting money from someone like, say, Jeffrey Epstein. In order to do that well, I think this is where it takes some organizational theory. I think we've got to really confront some of the challenges in understanding what are the obligations of a nonprofit. And here I'm thinking mostly about 501c3s, so charitable nonprofits in particular. I think it's important because it can be quite different from if anyone recently saw Jonathan Marks's new book, The Perils of Partnership. There's been a lot of thinking about government's obligations to maintain integrity, to not be corrupted. But I think the nonprofit space is a little bit funkier because you just don't have the same kind of stringent criteria about representative democracy. The lines of accountability are much less clear. So I'll say a little bit about that. Then the first half of the paper really kind of culminates in this big table that I'll walk you through, which is a typology of donations and risks. And then we'll get to the preliminary framework for how a nonprofit could potentially think about assessing individual donations that come through. So my pipe dream for this whole thing, being kind of a manager scholar, is that at the end, I could go to a nonprofit and say, here's a framework. You can sit down with your development team, and each gift that comes in, you can say, let's ask a series of questions. And this would lead us down, you know, maybe not a decision tree, but would give us some instinct about whether that is a donation that you want to accept or a donation that you want to reject. And then at the very end, I'll just call out some special considerations. Things like, what is the appropriate role for anonymity in gift giving? How should we think about regifting? So for instance, Harvard recently, after all of the MIT scandal with Jeffrey Epstein having given money, Harvard went through its coffers and said, do we have any money from Jeffrey Epstein? Of course we have money from Jeffrey Epstein. And they found $186,000 left over in account. And so the question was then, okay, if you're a nonprofit and you have found you already accepted kind of tainted money or dirty money, then can you just give it to another nonprofit? That is what Harvard is planning to do. They said, we're not going to keep this $186,000. We're going to give it to another local nonprofit. I'm, of course, thinking, well, what nonprofit is going to line up to take that money after you have publicly declared that this is untenable money and no one should take it? But I'll touch on that right at the end. Okay, so just maybe 2 framing slides. I think we're in a moment of just widespread recognition that there are ethics to financial relationships that maybe deserve some deeper scrutiny. So you could think about, let's start with the Cosby Show first. Individual consumers asking themselves, how do I want to relate to musical artists, movie stars that have been found to do wrong or even accused to do wrong? So should I still watch the Cosby Show? Should I still pay for Michael Jackson's music? Should I still buy Woody Allen films? Things like this. Then you can think about maybe business-to-business relationships. So this would be something like, I don't know if people followed this as closely because it was Boston-centric, but in Boston, we've got Wayfair, the furniture company. And when a number of Wayfair employees found out that Wayfair had a standing contract with US Department of Border Patrol, and they were the ones operating the ICE facilities, then there was a fairly large walkout of Wayfair employees who said, we do not want to work at a company that would be engaged in this kind of business. That is just a straight B2B, business-to-business contract. But again, I think people raising some alarm about the nature of financial transactions. Staying in the for-profit space, we could think about something like SoftBank. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but this is a big venture fund, very popular in Silicon Valley. If you are a startup, you desperately want SoftBank money because SoftBank makes what are known as king-making grants. They'll inject hundreds of millions of dollars into your business. And the idea has kind of been SoftBank will pick one startup in a given space, and whoever they back tends to be the one that makes it. The issue with that is that SoftBank is very strongly backed by a whole set of Saudi actors, including MBS himself. And so if you were to Google and think about kind of the ethics of financial transactions purely in a for-profit space, that's a pretty good indication of people wanting to reevaluate this in a startup world. Of course, in the nonprofit world, part of my title is that there are some particular challenges with being a nonprofit that make these things even thornier. But just to run you through some examples here, in case people, you've never had a run-in here at Colorado with any of these ethical dilemmas, Harvard is constantly being told it has to divest. It has to divest from a private prison complex. It has to divest from certain kinds of fossil fuels. And I think that's a movement unto itself, students saying, we've got to reevaluate these relationships. Some of you may remember the Met in New York City famously refused a large Sackler gift, the Sacklers being the Prime family from Purdue Pharmaceuticals. And then, of course, most recently, we have the MIT Media Lab, which had the big expose by Ronan Farrow in the New Yorker because they had accepted Jeffrey Epstein money. They had not only accepted Jeffrey Epstein money, but they had purposely tried to make sure that no one, even inside the MIT Media Lab, knew that they were accepting Jeffrey Epstein money. And so we'll come back to this at the end, whether or not that purposeful effort to keep a gift anonymous is something we should laud or something that we should be deeply skeptical of. So when we conceptualize nonprofits, I think there's maybe three things that are relevant and unique to nonprofits that make it really difficult to try and get to a place where you can understand clearly what their obligations are and what kinds of money they should take and not take. The first is that nonprofits are really uniquely dependent on external resources. So every organization is dependent in some way on its environment for external resources. But nonprofits have this really funny relationship where often the people that they're delivering services to are not the people that are paying them directly. A third party is paying them directly. And they don't have a lot of control over that third party. They don't necessarily know when that third party is going to be willing to give, how much they want to give, what their preferences are. So whereas a for-profit company, yes, it's dependent on external resources, they tend to know more about kind of what customers want. They can do a certain kind of testing. They can tweak the product that they're offering in order to get more resources from the external environment. But nonprofits tend to just kind of be like, we hope it rains money. We hope someone comes through and wants to give us money at this point for this project. And so they're just very, very dependent in a way that I think exceeds the standard external dependency for a for-profit corporation or government for that matter, which has a taxation power. The other thing that's fairly unique about nonprofits is they're just like infused with a certain degree of symbolic power. And I think this comes through most clearly when we think about, again, charitable nonprofits. But there's a sense that to do nonprofit work is to be a charitable person. To participate even on a volunteer basis is to be a charitable person. And these are kind of moral goods that even just an association with a nonprofit can bring the volunteer or the funder or the employee. There's been some interesting work on this, just thinking about organizations and how they transfer different kinds of credibility in the for-profit space, where when a for-profit company has some kind of big disaster on its hands, it has a scandal, what they can do is they can bring in a third party to do some kind of cleanup work, someone to do an environmental assessment or something like that. And when people in organizational theory study this, what they found is there's a credibility transfer that happens between this independent third party and the for-profit company. And I think you'll see, I'm getting to a point where I think, yeah, the nonprofit can serve that function as well. They can transfer some credibility, or I'll even go a step further and say some moral power to people who donate, who work, who volunteer across their organizational boundary. So infused with some kind of symbolic value. And then the third is this really strange thing where it's hard to know to whom a nonprofit is accountable. So whereas government representatives, and if you read the literature, particularly on like institutional corruption, Larry Lessig's work, Zephyr Teachout's work, they're really relying on this idea that governments are agents of the people. And there's a clear line of accountability, particularly between elected representatives and the people. And that makes it clear because then the elected representative or government writ large should always be acting in the public interest. Nonprofits, you can kind of make an argument that they should be acting in the public interest, and you could do this maybe by saying, well, they get these big tax exemptions, and so we're all sort of buttressing nonprofit work by virtue of the foregone taxes that we allow. But it's not that same kind of like, nonprofits aren't necessarily formal representatives of the public in the same way that government representatives are. They're also not formal representatives or fiduciaries for shareholders, the way that we can draw some clearer lines of accountability in the for-profit space. They're just kind of like floating out there in a way that, again, I think these are the reasons that it makes it really hard to theorize clearly about to whom they're accountable and by what rules they should be playing when they're adjudicating acceptance or rejection. So let's just talk a little bit about like how we should think about donations, or how I'm thinking about donations at the moment. I think it's easy when we talk about donations to imagine a one-way transfer. So I have money and I am going to give it to Eric and he will receive it, and it's a one-way transfer. You're welcome. But I think that's not quite the right way to think about it. And so I think instead we should think about donations in terms of exchanges. And the reason that's not totally intuitive is because one part of the exchange, the donation, is highly visible, and what the donor gets in return is often less visible. But I'm going to tell you what I think it is. So donors rarely, if ever, receive nothing in return for a donation. To get to a point or a circumstance where we could hypothesize about a donor receiving nothing in return, I think you have to really strain some credulity. So you could imagine like a total misanthrope who is alone. He tells no one about his donation. He puts cash in an envelope and he sends it to a nonprofit. The nonprofit doesn't know where it came from. Maybe you could say that that person who's making a donation gets nothing in return. But even there, it's kind of hard because, as I'll say in a moment, many donors give because it gives them some sort of warm glow or a sense of self-satisfaction. So that's why I say it's got to be like a misanthrope, someone who's just like miserable. But then you get into questions of, well, then why would they donate in the first place? But like, you've got to really go down a fairly far-fetched path, I think, to get to a place where donors receive nothing in return for a donation. So nonprofits may actually take action. So the question is, what are they getting in return? Well, nonprofits may take action to give something to a donor. And they may do that for two reasons. You know, one might say, well, it's Jeffrey Epstein donating. Why would you ever give him anything in return? I think maybe there's two reasons for this. One is there's just like a general norm in social life about reciprocity. It's just generally not seen as very upstanding to be ungenerous, or sorry, unappreciative. So if someone gives you something, there's just a general instinct that says, I should express my gratitude, say thank you, and potentially repay them at some point down the line. That's just baked into our social norms. The second reason that nonprofits may do something or give something to donors is what Jonathan Marks calls the tyranny of the next gift. So if you've given me money, Christine's given me money, I'm a nonprofit, I'm very grateful, even if she's a wrongdoer, and even if I don't have any ways to thank her now necessarily, I really want to keep Christine engaged because in 3 years' time, I need to re-up this gift, I need to re-up this program, I need to fund the next set of things I want to do. And so I do little things to try and make sure that Christine feels recognized and appreciated. I have my executive director write her a lovely note saying how grateful we are. We invite her to the annual party, all of these things. And so there's both just a general norms reason, and there's a reason that is kind of more instrumental or functional for growing the nonprofit over time, that nonprofits may be willing to give a donor something in return for their gift. Do you have a question? No? Okay. Just want to make sure. If anyone has a question, feel free to stop me. I'll cut us off if I think we're not going to make the 1 hour mark, but I'm happy to hear from you at any point. And then I would just say, particularly when gifts are made public, meaning they're not made anonymously, they're not made in secret, nonprofits can and do, I think, transfer this kind of moral power. And so this is where there's something of a leap, because what is moral power, and is moral power always transferred? I'll say a little bit more in a moment, but I think it's the right framework for thinking about the stakes of accepting donations, particularly from wrongdoers. So a bit more on moral power. This is from a sociologist, Randall Collins. I just like it. Philanthropists are effectively trading wealth for the moral prestige of being a charitable donor. And I think if you see things through that lens, suddenly the stakes go up for these kinds of acceptances. I really hammer this point. Maybe in this room, people are like, oh, enough, like we get it. But let me tell you, when you sit at Harvard Business School, you have to really make the case that not every dollar should just be accepted, because many people will say, well, all money's dirty money. Why should we have any scruples about this at all? This is my argument for why we should have some scruples. So philanthropists are effectively trading the moral prestige for wealth. And I'm sorry, I didn't know how far away these were going to be. It's a little bit small. But I wanted to just read you a little bit from the New York Times just last month. It's about Jeffrey Epstein, but it illustrates the case well. So Mr. Epstein went out of his way. This is an article about his time in the Virgin Islands. He went out of his way to ingratiate himself with local leaders. He donated 50 computers that a local senator could give away at schools and youth organizations. He financed programs at an elite local private school. He sponsored scholarships for a beauty pageant and a 2014 science and math fair for the children of the Virgin Islands. In 2012, one of his companies, Southern Trust, applied to take part in a tax cut program and cited his donations as a selling point. This is his lawyer speaking. Those of you who know Mr. Epstein, he has been a long-term resident of the Virgin Islands, know that he has given generously over the course of the last 11 years to various charities in the Virgin Islands. And this was at a public hearing about the tax cut program application. And so I think this is where you start to see the danger of lending moral power to wrongdoers, is as one of these nonprofits, you accept the money and then you give the person the ability to go out and deploy that kind of gift or moral power in all sorts of ways that you then cannot control. Maybe here it's getting some kind of tax cut. In other places, it's gaining entrance to different circles, but you don't have control over how they use that. So this is the typology of gifts. I've laid some breadcrumbs, I think, throughout. So I think maybe we can think in terms of 3 kinds of gifts. We have secret gifts, we have anonymous gifts, and then we have public gifts. I would say secret gifts are the most rare, although Maimonides was the one who told us the best way to give is what he called anonymously, but I'm calling secret here. Anonymous is, I think, slightly more common, and then public is by far the most common way of donating, in part because nonprofits have adopted a stance where they say, we disclose our donations in the annual report, if not on our tax filings. But so let's walk through them all again. Secret, I'm calling only the donor knows of the origin of the gift. So think back to the misanthrope idea. Someone puts money in an envelope, slides it under the doorstep of a nonprofit. That's that secret category. Anonymous, I'm calling where only the donor and the nonprofit know. Now I know we could quibble about what's really anonymous versus secret. This is how I'm using the term, because in nonprofit world, anonymous usually means both the recipient and the giver know about the gift, but the public does not know. And then we have public, the public knows the origin. So what are the benefits to the donor? I think if we go back again to the secret idea, maybe the only benefit we can come up with is this kind of warm glow, a sense that I've contributed to something that means something to me, and I feel good about myself for having partaken in a charitable enterprise. Anonymous, as you'll see, they all build. So in anonymous, you have both the warm glow benefit potentially to a donor, but then you also may have things, goodies, that the nonprofit wants to give the donor in return. So maybe that's an invitation to a particular gala. Maybe it's signage or kind of promotional materials. We thank the American Dental Association, or pick a for-profit company. We thank Coca-Cola for their generous gift to our programming. Then at the public level, you could have both warm glow in the donor themselves. You could have reciprocal gifts from the nonprofit, ways that they're trying to say thank you. And then you have this third idea, which is the public, who did not necessarily directly benefit from the gifts themselves, observe that the gift happened, and they say, man, that Jeffrey Epstein, he seems like a great guy. And so you can have kind of ancillary benefits that are bestowed on the donor, not from the nonprofit themselves, but from other members of the public, because this is a public gift. So there, think of it, well, I'll come back to that. Let's now go to the risks of harm. So when I talk about benefits, I try and think generally in at least like morally agnostic, if not positive terms. Now this last column is my effort to kind of draw out what are the risks or what are the harms. So when you have a warm glow effect, you could have a sense in which the donor feels a sense of moral cleansing, or they have a different kind of moral license. There was recently an MBER paper that showed that it is the corporations that do the most corporate social responsibility that also have the greatest amount of harm that is ongoing in their standard business practices. And that paper hypothesized that they're doing this CR as a way of maybe just cleansing the consciousness of employees who work there in order to continue running the business the way they do. They think about it almost as an offset. That could be a concern. If we go to anonymous, we've got that same concern, maybe that derives from the moral cleansing or the license. But then you could also have, of course, there's a vast literature on the conflicts of interest, but you could have conflicts of interest at the nonprofit that lead them to lessen the amount of good that they would otherwise do. So think in this case about, I worked very recently with a nonprofit in Boston. They do healthy food. They're a nonprofit retail organization. So they sell healthy food. They have had very high nutritional standards around sodium and fat for everything that's in the store. But then a large sugar sweetened beverage company approached them and said, well, we'd like to make a donation, but we'd also like you to carry some of our products. And of course, this was a nonprofit struggling to get by, really wanted to make a go of it. So they said yes. You could imagine many other instances of nonprofits kind of shaping the programming that they do, maybe even canceling certain programs in order to meet the desires or the needs of the donor. Then if we go down to public, we've got both of those concerns. We could also have the concern, because this is a public gift, around image rehabilitation or whitewashing. And so here you might think of an organization that is regulated less harshly because government or others just have a general sense like, you know, they're good corporate citizens. Look at all of the giving that they do. This is certainly not unheard of. There are many instances, particularly in the public health literature. I want to just go back to call out one other example. I don't know if anyone saw, but AT&T made a series of donations to nonprofits. This hit the press a few months ago. It was a paper out of UChicago about the way in which corporations can use nonprofits to do their bidding. AT&T made all of these gifts to all these nonprofits, seemingly unrelated. It was kind of a helter-skelter portfolio, LGBTQ organizations, homeless organizations, food organizations. And then these very endeavoring researchers went through and said, what kind of holds all of these together? What's going on? And they found that all of those organizations had been willing to lobby on AT&T's behalf when there was the question about whether or not there could be a merger. And so they found all of these public statements. AT&T had clearly asked the nonprofits, would you be willing to write on our behalf? The nonprofits had written on their behalf and said, AT&T, they're a great corporate citizen. They've given us all these money. You should let the merger go through. And so it's a very damning paper. I highly encourage it. But I just wanted to call that out as an additional way in which we might think kind of conflict of interest or whitewashing can actually beget some harm. And then, of course, the last one, I've put it just under public, but it could be throughout, is this idea of like a loss of trustworthiness. And it's not totally clear where to put that in terms of the kind of harm, but I think particularly when gifts are public, there is just this sense that nonprofits, which are, remember, if you buy it, infused with symbolic power, considered the last bastion of kind of moral decency and uprightness, are then going to also be compromised. They're also selling out to corporate interests, and that loss of trustworthiness may spill over not just from an individual nonprofit, but to the sector as a whole, or more generally, even as people think about a loss of faith in institutions, this would be a contributing factor. Okay, so now we're on to basically the second part of the paper. We're looking on time. So with that kind of table or diagnostic framework in hand, now you say, okay, pragmatically, we need something of a framework. And I think the goal for the framework, again, my pipe dream, is to create one that would allow nonprofits themselves to assess individual gifts with integrity. I use integrity to mean something like they have a set of principles, they apply them consistently, and they're willing to be transparent about the way that their principles inform their decision making. The challenge, I think, is to accommodate some really different intuitions. So there are a number of things that people say, it's an absolute no. No matter what the size of the gift, no matter what nonprofit you ask me to hypothetically put myself into, it's a no all day long, every day, forever. Then there are some things that I could throw out to you and say, oh, that's an absolute yes. I have no problem taking that gift. And then there's a ton, and I know this because I've been trying to draw up all sorts of survey questions to gauge people's empirical intuition. There's just a ton of cases that you put out to people and they say, well, I would need more information to know. So that's like the it depends category. The absolute no's, I would say, I've talked to probably 50 nonprofit managers at this point, and I run them through a series of hypotheticals. Even the people who get on the phone with me and they say, basically, Lauren, I think this is a stupid project. All money is dirty money, and I'm willing to take any of it because the work I do is that important. I can usually get them to an absolute no when I say the following. Okay, you say you'd take any money because it's all dirty money. How do you feel about the American Nazi Party? And almost everyone, in fact, everyone, says, oh, yeah, no, that one I couldn't take. So there is some category of things. And I would say to an organization that has a $500,000 budget, what if they gave you $5 million, 10x your annual budget? And they're like, it's still a no. So I think there are some cases where people just say, it's a no. It's an absolute no. There's many more things that I say, okay, you're a health clinic. What if Coca-Cola came? And that's one where people say, they want to say no, but if I amp the numbers up high enough and I say it's a $5 million gift, you've got a $500 million budget, many people can get to yes. So it really depends on the kind of specific design of the philanthropic offer. But I think that's the challenge in coming up with a framework, is having both some set of kind of consequentialist reasoning where people could take into account the fact that at certain threshold values of money, and maybe with certain other features of the offer, like let's say it's an unrestricted grant as opposed to a restricted grant. Let's say they're not asking for naming rights. Let's even say they want to be kept anonymous. I can get people to yes. So some part of it has got to be consequentialist, but the real challenge is then figuring out if you want to have some hard no's, on what basis do you want to carve out those hard no's, and what should the threshold questions be for those? So I'll show you where I've got to. It's preliminary, and again, I'm sorry to my future self who may watch this video and say, oh, that's not good enough, but here's where I am on October 14th, 2019. I think there's some things, this is me kind of trying to draw the world of all possible donations. I think there are some things that are a categorical reject. And then I think there are some things that are not necessarily a categorical accept, but they're not a categorical reject, meaning maybe I could get you there through some kind of additional information, and you could run some kind of cost benefit in your head and get to a yes, but it's not guaranteed you would get to a yes. Then I think there's this interesting scenario around emergency conditions, and I'll say a bit more about it in a moment, but I think in certain emergencies, what Michael Walzer called supreme emergencies, his idea of emergency ethics is really relevant, and there may actually be some cases where it is immoral to say no. I think they're very rare, but I think there are some, and I welcome your thoughts on it. And then there's this funky kind of in-between category, which I'm calling reparative giving, but some people would talk about it as kind of moral compensation, where it is a gift giver or a donor who would ordinarily fall into your categorical reject, but because they say something to the effect of, we are looking to make amends for the wrong we did, we acknowledge it, we promise not to do it again, and we're trying to actually create the capacity to build back up or repair some of the harm we did, it might, I put it on the line because it would ordinarily be a categorical reject, but I think it might then, under certain conditions, be a not categorical reject, and I'll say more. So I just wanted to show it to you at the outset, and then I'll go through the pieces one by one. So I think most gifts are morally neutral, meaning they are not intrinsically morally wrong. We could debate this. I have debated this with many people, but I think they are morally neutral because acceptance, first of all, the acceptance itself is kind of, it's a transfer of wealth in some sense, or even if it's an exchange, it has both costs and benefits. But I don't think most gifts are violating some kind of like deep and intrinsic moral principle. Again, if people want to say that they do, I welcome it. One of the ones that some people, I actually went down the path for a long time of saying, well, could we say they are violating some kind of deep and intrinsic moral principle by basically making recourse to kind of Larry Lessegin's effort teach-outs work on government and saying it's a corrupting influence, and that nonprofits have an obligation not to be corrupted the same way that government has an obligation not to be corrupted. But then you go back to what I was saying earlier about the lines of accountability for nonprofits being very unclear. Well, on what basis would we say that nonprofits have an obligation not to be corrupted? They're independent entities. They receive some public money, but they could wake up every day forever basically and change their mission statement to accommodate new kinds of gifts that were coming in if they wanted to. That's a decision that the board and the senior management can make. And so there's not really the same kind of through thread that you would say, oh, absolutely, they have this enduring mission to serve the public interest. Not really, or not one that I can see. And so I found it really hard for most gifts to find some kind of underlying ethical principle that's violated with the acceptance. That's not to say it doesn't bring both costs and benefits. It does, but I don't think it's intrinsically wrong. So I think in these cases, you can reason through whether or not to accept or reject a gift that is morally neutral through something called the logic of double effect. Many of you may know it because it's used in bioethics from time to time, and I'll show you a bit more about it. But the key question is there a proportionally grave reason to permit the bad effects on the kind of benefit side? And I think the one thing I'd say about this is it's slightly different from a cost-benefit analysis, because in a cost-benefit analysis, you're kind of aggregating the costs and aggregating the benefits, and then trying to say which has more. This one at 54 benefits and 50 costs, I take it, or you're doing that kind of counting. Here, there may just be one proportionally grave benefit to outweigh the cost, but you're not having to aggregate. It's just kind of a summary judgment. In the logic of double effect, in order for an act to be relevant, to be evaluated this way, the act itself needs to be morally neutral. It needs to have side effects. The good effects cannot be, the bad effects cannot be a means to good effects. They both need to be side effects. And the bad effects need to be foreseen but not intended. And then at the end, you basically have a proportionality criteria where you ask yourself, is there a proportionately grave reason for permitting the bad effects? So the key distinction here in many cases is the distinction between foreseen and intended. This is where a lot of the bioethics literature has resided, trying to make heads or tails of, is it important if something is foreseen but not intended? For our purposes here, I don't think that's a hard criteria to meet. I think when organizations, nonprofits are considering evaluating gifts, the bad effects are foreseen, but they're not intended. Nonprofits aren't accepting money saying, yeah, I really want to burnish the reputation of Philip Morris. It is anticipated, but not intended. The real kind of kicker here for our purposes is this proportionality condition. And you come down to a set of fairly complex questions about like, how much moral power do I think I'm lending this group? And that may depend on the size of the nonprofit. So I have said, there may be cases where the same gift can be offered to Harvard Medical School and a very small anonymous community-based organization in Massachusetts. And they may both do kind of a logic of double effect analysis, and Harvard may say no to that gift because they're concerned that the bad effect of Harvard lending moral power to the donor is very big, but a small community-based organization who's anonymous would not be lending the same amount of moral power, and their bad effects would be less, and so they take the gift. So the same gift can be accepted and rejected, I think, where it's morally neutral by different organizations of different sizes and different kind of public reputations. I'm happy to come back to any of this, but I'm going to run us through it and then we can talk. Some gifts I think, are morally wrong. And so the real challenge, I think, of the whole paper is coming up with the threshold question for on what basis are they morally wrong. But the fact that I ask people and I say American Nazi Party, yes or no, and everyone gives me a resounding no, makes me think I should hold some space in my thinking for things that are considered intrinsically or morally wrong. There might be two ways to think about this group of gifts, and I'll tell you a little bit about both of them. One is to think in terms of the wrongful benefit principle, or ill-gotten gains. So this is the idea, and it comes out of both like common law and even back to kind of biblical theological instruction. But it's the idea that it is wrong to be the beneficiary of wrongdoing. Therefore, nonprofits should not accept money from culpable wrongdoers who have profited from their crimes. And that parenthetical is my way of saying, in some ways, as I tell you more about it, you may find, I mean, yes, that gives us a leg to stand on to say no to certain gifts, but there's all sorts of other gifts that I also think are really morally wrong that this doesn't capture. So here's what it does capture usually. There's 4 kinds of kind of wrongful benefit principle violations, and they grow more and more controversial as you go from 1 to 4. So people generally say, you shouldn't benefit from your own culpable act. You shouldn't get to rob a bank and keep the proceeds of the robbery. That's just wrong because you stole them. They're not really appropriately yours in the first place. And so when we take legal action against people, we say, you've got to give those monies back if you're the one who robbed a bank. Most people agree, yeah, that one seems pretty airtight. Then some people say, you shouldn't be able to benefit even if you were innocent, meaning you didn't mean harm, but you caused harm and you profited from it. Not that important, so I'm going to skip that one. Type 3 is the one that's most relevant for our conversation today, and that says you shouldn't accept profits from another's culpable act, meaning the corporation or the donor has done something wrong. They have profited from that wrongdoing, and because they don't even have a rightful claim to those profits, you as the nonprofit should not take their ill-gotten gains. So the wrongful benefit principle really runs into like borderline metaphysical claims about the profits themselves being tainted. So I could walk you through kind of a side-by-side, but essentially it's like, imagine there's 2 factories. One is in country A, one is in country B. They both pollute the same river. The river is the border. And they both profit from that wrongdoing. But in one case, the legal system takes action and says, you have to pay us back all the profits from your pollution. And in the other case, the legal system does not take action and they have just out and out profited from their pollution. The wrongful benefit principle would say it is wrong to take money from the corporation who profited, but it is not wrong to take money from the one that had to basically pay a fine, even though the wrongdoing is the same. So I say that just to illustrate that it's really about kind of following the money in the wrongful benefit principle view of the world. The reason some people find this unsatisfactory is because some people say, well, no, those 2 corporations both had factories doing the same wrong. I don't care if one made money and the other one didn't make money. I'm just not comfortable taking money from either of them because in both cases I feel like I'm endorsing bad behavior. So that's why people sometimes look at wrongful benefit and they say, I don't like it. I would just show you briefly maybe some of this. So this is a table from the paper. By the way, if anyone wants to see the full paper, I'm happy to share it with you. But I just wanted to show you there are kind of 2 types of things that would violate the wrongful benefit, and then there's some that maybe don't violate wrongful benefit. And we can think in terms of individual donors, and we can think in terms of corporate donors. So things that would violate wrongful benefit are things like robbing a bank, as I talked to you about before, running a Ponzi scheme. Down in the bottom left-hand corner from a corporation, you might say accepting a donation from a corporation whose business was by nature exploitative would be a violation of the wrongful benefit principle, so you shouldn't take those. Maybe prostitution is not the best example there. Think about forced labor instead. And then you've got this other category that I've said is important to think about, and this gets into like kind of the nature of culpability. Some people will say, well, you're only culpable if you knew. And what if the nonprofit didn't know that its product was, what if the corporation didn't know if its product was addictive? Well, I think we could also ask a meaningful question about should they have known? And so I would argue, if you are going to go down a wrongful benefit path, you need to ask, did they know they were doing harm? Should they have known they were doing harm? And did they profit from it? And if all 3 of those criteria are met, you would say no thank you, a categorical reject to those donors if you're the nonprofit. Now, as I said, some people don't buy it because people don't like this kind of quasi-metaphysical nature about having to follow the money and saying that whether or not the donor profited from it is important. Because I could set up something for you like, okay, you're running a nonprofit. There are two potential donors. One is a corporation that has like low to medium level of tax evasion on its record, but it profited from the tax evasion, right? It took in or it kept additional monies. And this other person is a serial rapist. That serial rapist did not profit from their crimes. And so again, if you're in a wrongful benefit view of the world, you would say no to the corporation that had like low to medium levels of tax evasion. And you would say, yes, I'll take the money from the serial rapist. And so because that kind of strikes many people as just, I don't like that, you may have to go to a different kind of reason to categorically reject. So again, going back to this idea that some gifts are morally wrong, you could have a categorical reject. I've walked you through the wrongful benefit principle view of how you might create threshold questions for why you would say no. This second one, the duty of repair, I think is another way to reason to the same kind of outcomes through different means. So you could say, look, it's not about the money at all. There's just a duty of repair in our kind of moral world that says when you do something wrong, you owe it to the person you did wrong to either pay them back or at the very least acknowledge the harm that you've done. And so if there is a duty of repair to the victims of one's wrongdoing, then nonprofits, again, should not accept money from wrongdoers who have created victims that they have neither acknowledged nor repaid. Because in some sense, nonprofits, by accepting that money, would be in essence jumping the queue and saying, oh, we failed to recognize the victims of your wrongdoing, and we are, yes, going to step right up and accept your beneficence, when really that beneficence is owed to the victims of the wrongdoing. This is kind of a more expansive way to think about why a nonprofit might say no to certain kinds of donors. And I think the risk here is it's overly expansive. Like you could say every kind of wrong has a harm, and that unless kind of both corporations and individuals who want to donate go around in a very kind of Yom Kippur fashion saying, I'm sorry, I acknowledge, I repay, then maybe there's just no money to be had for nonprofits at all on the table. And we need to think through some additional threshold criteria. Like maybe we only think you say absolutely no to a wrongdoer whose victims are both identifiable and alive, or something like that. I don't know what the right threshold criteria are at the moment, but I think if you want to go down the path of saying there's just a general duty of repair that should prevent nonprofits from accepting that money, then we probably need to put a little bit of additional scaffolding around exactly which kinds of wrongdoing or which kinds of donors really are categorical no's versus which ones most of us would probably say, it might be unsavory, but I don't think it's intrinsically wrong. Then we've got this emergencies point. And I would just ask you to think, if you have an intuition that, I don't like the idea of overriding certain moral principles in an emergency, think about an Ebola relief organization that's offered money from a local warlord in the midst of an Ebola outbreak. I think it's 2014. And the question is, would you say to that organization, yes, accept, or no, reject? I've walked you through a number of scenarios where I think typically a warlord could fit into the categorical reject category. But frankly, my intuition here is they should accept. And that's a problem for, all of value-based reasoning, because it leads me back to a fairly consequentialist, like, but it's really dire circumstances, what do you do? I think here Michael Walzer is really useful, and he's written a lot on emergency ethics. His kind of domain of expertise is war, but I think it can be relevant, again, in select circumstances. So he says, look, in supreme emergencies, which he defines as ones in which the actual constituency of a community is threatened, it can be defensible, though he stops short of saying it is morally right. It's just defensible to undertake actions that in other situations would be morally wrong. And again, he makes this really clear difference, because people read him and said, oh, well, then you're just willy-nilly saying some things are wrong here and they're right here, and they're wrong here and they're right here. And he said in his latest writing, I'm not saying that it's right, but I'm saying it's defensible, and it's what we would want our particularly elected representatives to do. So again, this comes back to a bit of a rub between elected representatives and nonprofits, but I think it's relevant enough. And I would say also, just though I gave you the example of an Ebola relief organization, and I think that's a good one to think about supreme emergencies in, there may be some nonprofit organizations who just never face a supreme emergency and therefore would never be able to kind of execute a decision making on the basis of this kind of emergency ethics framework. So frankly, while I love arts organizations, I think they may be ones that never reach a supreme emergency and therefore never actually get to say yes to organizations that they would otherwise have said no to due to this kind of emergency environment. The last piece is this idea about reparative giving, or remember I mentioned some people call it like compensatory or moral compensatory giving. So now consider someone who profited from exploitative labor practices and now wants to donate to a workers' rights organization. I think, again, someone ordinarily who profited from exploitative labor would fit pretty clearly in the categorical reject, whether you're living in a wrongful benefit principle view of the world, or you want to take that slightly more broad, just duty of repair view. And now they want to donate. So the question is, should we take it? In cases where the donor means to make a kind of reparations for wrongdoing, I think we can take things from a categorical reject to a not categorical reject. I don't know that I want to take them all the way to a categorical accept, but I think we don't have to keep them in like the all out and out, absolutely no. I think there are some conditions for this though. So in order for something to meet the criteria of being reparative or compensatory, you need this kind of coupling of the donor's wrongdoing and the nonprofit purpose. So if you're an organization that polluted the environment, I think we only think about reparative or compensatory giving when you're considering giving to an environmental protection organization. These next three all come from actually Catholic theology and the thinking around indulgences in the Catholic Church, but I think they're relevant here. The three are: the donor has publicly acknowledged their wrongdoing, the donor has expressed an intention not to commit that wrongdoing again, and the donor has expressed genuine interest in creating societal benefits rather than just reputation burnishment. And I think in cases where all four of those criteria are met, we might take a gift that is ordinarily in the categorical reject pile and put it into a let's talk more about it, let's analyze it according to that logic of double effect framework. I just want to touch on a few special considerations and then we can talk this all through. One is the role of anonymity. This got a lot of press most recently because Larry Lessig wrote a Medium post. He's an institutional corruption scholar at Harvard. He wrote a Medium post reflecting on Jeffrey Epstein's gift to MIT. And if any of you guys read the Ronan Farrow piece in the New Yorker, Ronan Farrow, the journalist, really skewered MIT and said, look, I've got all these emails that are really making clear the fact that you all in MIT Media Lab knew that this guy was not a good guy. You accepted his money anyway, and you went through like elaborate efforts to try and keep his identity not known, not only from the public, but from people within MIT. So they like had code names for Jeffrey Epstein. They wouldn't put him on people's schedule, this kind of thing. And so Ronan Farrow, the journalist, I think speaking from like a fairly common sense intuition, said, it's doubly bad that you accepted the money and then you kind of forced this kind of anonymity on the gift in order to basically hide your wrongdoing. It's a classic, like the cover up is worse than the crime. Institutional corruption scholar Larry Lessig writes a Medium post on this and says, whoa, 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 I think we've got this really wrong. In fact, I think there are cases where a nonprofit has to accept really unsavory gifts from the likes of Jeffrey Epstein. And when they do, they should only do so if they enforce this kind of anonymity on the donor and they go through these elaborate efforts to try and keep the donor's identity unknown. So that is kind of the back and forth right now in the discussion. I think most non-academics that I talk to continue to agree with Ronan Farrow. No, you should not accept any money that you then have to cover up. That's a violation of just where I started saying, I want nonprofits to be able to make gifts with integrity, meaning their principles and their actions match, and they can do it transparently. If that's what we think integrity means, then using anonymity as a tool to kind of negotiate your way to accepting money from really bad people or really bad corporations is not okay. I don't have a great answer for this, but I would say I think a potentially interesting analog is now when you unfortunately continue to have mass casualty events, news anchors themselves know the identity of the perpetrator, but they often say, we are purposefully not disclosing this person's name because the same reason. We don't want to burnish their reputation. We don't want them to continue to live on in some kind of infamy and dark circles of the internet. And so they say explicitly to you as a viewer, we know it and we're not telling you. And basically implicitly they're saying, and we think you should agree and be comfortable with this kind of non-transparency that we're specifically carving out for public reasons. And I think maybe some middle ground, and this is something I'm testing empirically, is nonprofits in some situations could do the same thing. So they could say, we disclose our donors. There are certain donors that we do not disclose. And we do that because we don't want to give them any kind of moral benefit, but we accepted their money because we want the money to do the important work that we as this nonprofit do. I think you would have to tell donors in advance that they would be in that category and say, okay, Jeffrey Epstein or the next Jeffrey Epstein will accept the money, but we're never going to talk about it. You can't talk about it. Sign an NDA. Here's how we're going to deal with this. Many may back off in that case because what they're giving, the purpose of the giving in the first place is for the burnishment. But I think that might be one kind of middle ground, and that like news anchor strategy is one that we could copy here. There's this other question. These are just kind of interesting tidbits and fodder for conversation, as if I haven't given you enough. There's this question about regifting and laundering. I alluded to it before with Harvard. They find $186,000 inside their coffers. And the question is, what do you do with it? How do you launder, or how do you get back to some kind of clean money when it's been found and it's unclean? There's one theory out there from a political theorist who says, look, the only way to clean money is basically to give it to the state, because the state is the ultimate commons. And when you route things through the state or the government, that's the only way that it can then become like eligible again for regifting. So by that theory, Harvard should not be making a gift directly from itself to another nonprofit in the Boston area. They should basically surrender the money to the state of Massachusetts or to the city of Boston, and then let the state or the city give it out as a grant program or something like that to other nonprofits that apply. In some sense, I think this accords with our intuition, because if you remember in the big tobacco settlements, people feel differently about when the state, in particular when the state seizes things forcefully from wrongdoers. No one seemed to have any trouble in the nonprofit world taking money from those tobacco settlements. People were not saying, ooh, this is dirty money. So that lends maybe some credence to this idea that the state is the appropriate launderer of funds. But someone might still say, whoa, 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 that's not the right analogy, because in the tobacco settlements, as I said, the money was kind of forcefully taken from the tobacco companies. In the case of Harvard, maybe Harvard volunteering it to the state doesn't have the same effect, but that's an open question as well. And then the last bit I would just throw out, and then I'm done and we get to Q&A, is I think there's some really interesting questions about the interaction between legal and social sanctioning. So here's a concern of mine. In the current moment where nonprofits are very concerned about taking tainted or dirty money, and they're particularly concerned about the optics of it. Imagine you're a violence prevention organization and someone wants to donate funds to you. This person is convicted of a murder 20 years ago. They went to jail, they served their sentence, and they've come back out, and they want to make a gift. I can imagine nonprofits at the moment saying, we don't want to take that gift. The optics are too tricky, and so we're going to say no. I worry about nonprofits kind of socially punishing people that have already been legally punished. And so in cases where someone has done something wrong, been legally tried, found guilty, punished, you know, my intuition is I don't want nonprofits to continue to punish them by not taking the money. But again, we're back to this issue of like, on what grounds, or to whom do they have an accountability that we could say, yeah, for sure they shouldn't do that. So this may be a different paper one day, but I think this interaction of legal sanctioning or legal punishment and social punishment is going to become a very open question. And it's kind of picking up on some of the concerns that people already have about cancel culture. How long do people have to stay canceled? Who has the right to cancel people culturally? It's kind of that in a nonprofit and taking into account legal punishment, but an open question that I'd love your thoughts on. All right, Q&A. The only thing I'll say before I take Q&A is if anyone wants a copy of the paper, I would love to share it with you. It's a work in progress, but I would really appreciate the feedback. And with that, we got a couple minutes. Thanks. Yeah, please.
Thanks. Let's see if I can get it right this time. So a great talk, and it's a very elegant theory. One thing that struck me that you didn't address is that categories change, and that there may be incentive for inappropriately placing somebody in a category. So, you can sort of see no evil, hear no evil, and yet there are legitimate times where, like, for example, there was a point in time where Jeff Epstein would have been in your sort of no-brainer category, and so one, what would you, or I don't know if your theory is going to deal with this, what would you propose for gifts that have happened and then later become tainted? And secondarily, the incentive that may come from being selective about what information you pay attention to if their category is not apparent to everybody else.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should say, I think Jeffrey Epstein is like a very attractive case to reason with because it's on the top of everyone's mind. But I think it's a really difficult case to reason with for two reasons. One is we don't really know where his money came from. And so if you're into wrongful benefit, it's hard to figure out whether or not he fits the criteria of a wrongful benefit violation or he does not. The second is ostensibly he was legally punished, and yet there feels like there is widespread convergence, if not consensus, on the idea that he was punished, but he wasn't punished sufficiently. And so while I said at the end, I don't like the idea of nonprofits additionally piling on to someone who's already served a legal punishment, in his case, maybe we feel like, no, MIT Media Lab, you really should have said no because his punishment had not been sufficient. I think the question of, like, I heard you kind of gesturing to this question of what's a reasonable standard for what nonprofits can and should know about a potential donor? Like, do we want them to be the FBI and have giant files on every single donor? And I think that's a difficult one. I think I may wind up having to pivot to something like a reasonable person standard. Like if it's out in the open that everyone knows this organization's a polluter, or this person is a sexual harasser, and a reasonable person would know that, then maybe we expect the nonprofit to know it and act on it. But I also think, to your point about change over time, there probably were points in time, I don't know, let's not take Jeffrey Epstein again, but in Bill Cosby's life, that I would have said, yeah, in 1975, accept. In 1980, accept. In 2020, do not accept. And I think that just has to do with being reasonable, that different kinds of information come to light about different people's deeds and wrongdoing. But it's a really hard question about what's reasonable for nonprofits to know, both as like often individual under-resourced organizations with development teams that are not out there doing extensive background checks, and then this like longitudinal question of how quickly should they be taking up new information about a donor.
If you get new information, does that then change your obligation for a gift you've already received?
Yeah, I think it does, but I'm trying to scope that out of the paper because I think I'm going to try and address, so even the laundering and regifting stuff, I think I'm going to punt from this first paper just because there's so much to do even on the initial accept reject decision. But my intuition and a future paper I write is that it does, and you do have some obligation. It may not be to give the money back. It may not be to give the money to the state. It may just be some kind of public acknowledgement that we took this money, and while the wrongdoer was not willing to publicly acknowledge their victims, we as the nonprofit are willing to acknowledge it. So it may just be a public statement or something like that, but I do think they have some obligation. Yeah.
You for a very interesting talk. One of the struggles I'm having with understanding or appreciating your wrongful benefit principle is that who decides and determines what's wrong? Now, certain things, pretty clear, we all agree would be wrong. But other things I might think are really wrong, but other people might not. Let me give you two examples. Probably a lot of people in this room benefit and agree with National Public Radio, and they rely on donations. And you will hear sometimes that they have accepted money from the Coke industry. I don't mean C-O-K-E, I mean the Koch brothers, who have donated, money. In fact, they are big philanthropists to a lot of organizations, but they give money to NPR, directly. And the Joan Kroc Foundation, which was McDonald's. And probably many of the viewers of National Public Radio are not necessarily the biggest advocates for the type of things that mass beef production and everything over the years from the McDonald's fortune was created on. Nevertheless, I could see the board of NPR sitting down and saying, well,
That's right.
are we wrong to take this money? And some people saying yes, and some people saying no, and other people saying, well, they're just getting a 60-second notice on the thing, and NPR is very important, so we're going to go ahead. But so you see what I mean? It's not black and white.
Yep.
And your principle works really well when it's like, somebody who has exploited child labor or polluted horrifically or covered up contaminating a drug supply, whatever. But what about these other things? What about?
Great. So it's a great question. And I sent this to a friend who actually works in a nonprofit, this paper. And while all the academics had been like, yeah, it's pretty good. They were like, it's useless because you don't define what's wrong. So exactly your point. I think it's really hard to define what's wrong for a sector as diverse as the 501c3 sector that includes both like lobbying organizations, health organizations, arts organizations. And so what I do at the end of paper is basically create a table that lays out each of the kind of conceptual constructs. And then I say, so here are the questions you would have to ask yourself in your board meetings and in your senior management meetings. And on this question of wrongful benefit, it would be things like, I think everyone could agree, maybe we want to say things that are illegal qualify as wrongful benefit for our purposes. But how much beyond illegal do you want to go? So I think each organization has to choose for themselves. Do we say, we'll say absolutely no to things that are illegal and to things that are wrongs that are closely related to our organizational mission? Do we want to say wrong? We'll say no to illegal, things that are close to our organizational mission, and things that are some like broader category. But I think it's something that I just don't know that I'd be able to answer it for such a diverse sector. All I can do is kind of put out the construct at this moment in time and then say, here are the more granular questions for each nonprofit to ask in and of themselves to arrive at what would essentially be a gift acceptance policy for their organization. I wish I could do more, because when the nonprofit person wrote to me, they were like, you've carried the ball 20 yards down the field, but like I still have 80 yards to kind of make this up as I go along. But I think that is the nature of the task that I undertook. It's just so big that it would have to be subsequent papers with more sector specific kind of guidance. So maybe I could do one for nonprofit hospitals. Maybe I could do one for art museums, but they're going to be different. Yeah.
So when you talked about the regifting and laundering and giving the funds to the state like a neutral organization, is anyone from the primary source, like for example, if Harvard is giving the $186,000, is anyone from Harvard being able to hold the state accountable that this money is going back to benefiting people?
Yeah, it's a totally open question. I have no idea. I'm making this up as I go along. My sense is when they did the tobacco settlements, the nice thing was it was district attorneys and attorney general. So it was arms of the state who were going in to seize the money. And in the negotiations with the tobacco companies, they said, we're going to take this money and we're going to give it as grants to nonprofit organizations that do education and awareness around the dangers of smoking. So that was kind of prefabbed in that way. If we do want to go down a path, as I'm proposing, a little half-heartedly, that nonprofits that find themselves with dirty money in the coffers have to surrender it to the state, then, that has an implicit sense that like the state is a really competent and good actor and will know what to do with the money and use it efficiently. Of course, this work came from a political theorist. They had like high hopes for the state. Other people feel like, oh, that's a terrible idea because the state's just going to, fill holes in the budget with it and it's not going to go to any kind of benefit. I've also gotten the question of, great, Lauren, well, you've got a really US-centric view. What about nonprofits that operate in failed states or states that really, like we know from the get, are not going to have the capacity to take this in? And I haven't figured it out, to be honest. But it's a good question. I just don't know. Do you have another thought, or I'd be happy, anyone's thoughts, on other kind of mechanisms by which to clean dirty money?
So maybe instead of like a governmental organization like the state, and as you said, every state in the US functions separately, and if you look at it at a global scale, it's very different. So maybe like organization which kind of cleanses the money and then redirects it into nonprofits again. If there can be ideally an organization like that, I think that would be a great fit.
Yeah, an organization that's just like, bring me your dirty money and I will absorb all the moral taint there is so that others can be cleansed. Okay. I'm at time, so I gotta let you guys go. Thank you so much. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. And again, if anyone wants to see the paper, please just send me an email. I would love your feedback. Thanks. A little over time.